Sarah didn't move. She stood at the edge of the kitchen and watched her father cross the yard toward the man crouching in the gravel beside the old greenhouse foundation. The morning was cold enough to see breath. The man didn't look up. His hands moved over something low and deliberate, a rhythm that had nothing to perform in it, nothing that needed an audience. Declan Pruitt had been like that since the first morning he'd shown up, the kind of stillness you didn't expect from someone who worked with his hands. Sarah was 7. She hadn't spoken to a stranger in 2 years. She stood at the window another full minute before she moved toward the back door. 48 hours earlier, Vivian had not planned to bring Sarah to Harlow at all. The drive to northern Maine was supposed to be 3 days of logistics, nothing more. The Whitmore property, a former agricultural research station on 14 acres outside a town called Harlow, had come through Vantage Biosciences' acquisition pipeline, with the kind of pricing that made her team assume there was something wrong with it. There wasn't. The previous owner had died without direct heirs. The county had held the property for 2 years, at a carrying cost no one wanted to keep absorbing. Vivian's acquisition director had flagged it on a Tuesday. By Thursday, she'd signed the preliminary agreement. The plan was straightforward. Assess the main building's structural viability for a satellite laboratory, meet with the local contractor, authorize the next phase, and be back in Portland by the weekend. Sarah was supposed to stay with Aunt Rosalie in Portland, who understood the routines and knew how to make the transitions predictable enough that Sarah could hold herself together through them. But Rosalie had called Wednesday night with a fever and an apology, and Thursday morning, Sarah had woken already knowing something was wrong. Vivian had found her sitting on the floor of her bedroom in the dark, not crying, not rocking, just sitting the way she sat when the world had gotten too loud inside her head to manage. The school therapist called it selective mutism with anxiety. The pediatric psychologist called it trauma-adjacent language suppression. Vivian called it what it was. Her daughter had stopped talking to anyone outside their home, 8 months after Vivian's husband died, and in the 24 months since, she'd said 2 words to a non-family member. Both had been accidental. Neither had happened again. The specialist in Boston said what specialists always said: reduce unpredictability, protect established routines, facilitate controlled therapeutic exposure. And then, last September, she had added something she hadn't said before. The most meaningful breakthroughs often follow the child's own unstructured impulse. Not a program, not a schedule, an impulse. Vivian had thought about that sentence more than she'd expected to. She put Sarah in the car. Harlow received them the way small Maine towns receive people who arrive in October, without ceremony and without apology. The town sat along the Kennebec tributary with a grain elevator, a library that had once been a church, a diner that served breakfast until 2 in the afternoon, and the kind of maple trees that spent the fall looking like they were trying to say something urgent before the weather silenced them. The Whitmore property was 2 miles outside town on a road that turned to gravel after the second bend. The main building was a long, low structure, dark wood siding that had silvered over the years, 12 rooms, a greenhouse attachment on the east side that needed to come down, and a caretaker's shed near the back fence that had been built sometime in the 70s and looked like it intended to outlast everything around it. The property manager had arranged for a local contractor named Hank Briley, who met them in the gravel drive, shook Vivian's hand and said that Declan Pruitt was the best Finnish carpenter in the county and also the best structural reader he'd ever worked alongside. He said this with the precision of a man who had spent 40 years in the trade and did not give that sentence out casually. Declan arrived at 7:30 the next morning. He drove a truck that had been repainted at some point in a color that no longer matched any specific intention. He unloaded his tools without hurrying, walked the full building alone for 25 minutes. While Vivian followed at a distance, she kept professional, and then came back to the main room and said, "The east wall is carrying load it wasn't designed for. Whoever framed the greenhouse addition transferred stress to the wrong points. Before you do anything to that east wall, you need to understand what it's holding." He said it the way someone reports a fact that exists independent of whether you find it useful. Vivian made a note and said she'd have her structural engineer take a look. He nodded once and started work. She had been around men who possessed knowledge and needed her to register it. There was always an angle in it, a positioning, a performance of competence aimed at establishing terms. Declan Pruitt didn't seem to be establishing anything. He spoke as though the Walls situation was simply the Walls situation, and he'd mentioned it because she should know, and now he was going back to work. She found it unusual in a way she didn't immediately have language for. That evening, Sarah came with her to the property after dinner. Vivian needed to check measurements on the north corridor and hadn't wanted to leave Sarah alone in the rental house 2 miles away. She'd brought the old paperback and the small blanket and the system they'd developed. Sarah would find a corner, and Vivian would stay within visual range, and nobody would demand anything of anyone. Sarah found the east corridor, which had windows looking out to the back lot, where Declan was finishing something at a folding table in the last of the light. She stopped at the window. She put her hand against the glass. Declan looked up, not toward Sarah, not toward the window, just up in the general way of someone who felt a change in the air. Then he went back to what he was doing, didn't wave, didn't look over, just continued. Sarah stayed at the window for 11 minutes. Vivian counted. She told herself she was counting because she tracked these things for Sarah's records. This was partly true. Before he left that evening, Declan stopped at the table where Vivian had spread the preliminary floor plans. He studied the layout without being invited to, picked up the northeast section, and said, "What's the intended use for this room?" She said the plans called for a data storage annex. He set the sheet down. He said, "It reads like it was used for something that needed quiet. The wall thickness is inconsistent with standard utility construction. Somebody added insulation that wasn't in the original build." He left before she could ask him how he knew that. She didn't sleep well. He was there before 6:30 the next morning. Vivian had been awake since 5. She'd made coffee in the kitchen of the rental and stood at the window the way she'd been doing for 2 years when sleep wasn't cooperating, running through logistics that didn't require her to think about anything that mattered. She heard his truck on the gravel. She watched him carry something inside she didn't recognize. Flat panels, pale wood, different shapes, bound with canvas strapping. She crossed the lot 20 minutes later. He had set up in the northeast room, the room that had unusual wall insulation. He was working one of the panels with a block plane, drawing it in slow passes across the face, listening to the sound the blade made as it moved. He'd adjust the angle, draw it again, listen, adjust. She stood in the doorway and understood after a moment what she was looking at. The panels were curved, not dramatically, a gentle arc, specific and deliberate, the geometry of something designed to affect how sound moved between surfaces. She had seen panels like this once, in a facility in New Hampshire that Vantage had partnered with early in her tenure, a pediatric center. A room designed for children who experienced the world in ways that ordinary rooms didn't account for. Rooms where the acoustics were engineered not for music or recording but for nervous systems. For children who processed sensation before they processed language, who could feel the hostility of a room that was too live or too dead before they could name what they were feeling. This was not renovation work. Sarah appeared in the doorway of the northeast room, while Vivian was still standing against the far wall. She hadn't heard her come in. Sarah moved quietly, had always moved quietly, but in the last 2 years it had become something else. Not stealth, more like a constant assessment of whether it was safe to take up space. Declan didn't stop working. His hands kept moving, the plane making its low rhythmic sound against the wood. Consistent, undemanding, like weather. Sarah moved inside. She sat on the floor 6 feet behind him and watched. Vivian went to her laptop. She searched Declan Pruitt, carpenter, Harlow, Maine. Found a business listing 18 months old. No website. She searched Declan Pruitt, architect. Nothing immediate. She added Boston to the search. Then she added sensory design. The 4th result stopped her. It was a conference archive. Design and Neurodevelopment Symposium 2018. Speaker listing. She scrolled down and found his name under a session titled Spatial Language for Nonverbal Children. Architecture as Communication. She refined the search. She found the firm. Pruitt plus Hale Collaborative, Boston. She found the portfolio. 11 complete projects across 3 states. Pediatric rehabilitation centers, developmental therapy spaces, 1 residential campus in western Massachusetts for adolescents with complex communication profiles. Every project built around the principle that a child who had no spoken language still had a body that responded to physical space, to the height of a ceiling, the texture of a surface, the way sound either asked something of you or didn't. 2 published papers, a grant from the National Institute on Disability, a feature in an architecture journal in 2019 that she had read, she realized, sitting in an airport in Chicago, and had found interesting without retaining the author's name. She understood in the space of one clear second why Sarah had not been afraid of him. He had spent years learning the precise vocabulary of how not to frighten a child like her. She looked up. Across the room, something had changed. Declan had set down the plane and was showing Sarah the edge of one of the completed panels. Not explaining it, not teaching it, just holding it at an angle so she could see the curve. Sarah leaned forward incrementally. She reached out and touched the edge of the wood with the tips of 2 fingers. She pulled her hand back, then she touched it again. It was the first time in 2 years that Vivian had seen her daughter initiate contact with something a stranger had made. Vivian looked out the window at the gravel lot, at the October light on the fence line, and breathed for a moment through her teeth. Why had he left it? She had the portfolio open. She had the dates. The Pruitt plus Hale collaborative had dissolved in 2021. No announcement, no statement, just a series of projects that ended, a website that went dark, a name that stopped appearing in journals. She told herself she would ask him about it. She said this to herself with the confidence of a woman who asked about everything that was strategically useful to know. And then she watched him hold a curved panel steady while Sarah tapped it in 2 different places and listened to the difference. And she decided she wouldn't say anything yet. The reason she gave herself was that she didn't have enough information to know how to use it. She suspected this was not the actual reason. He noticed she was watching him differently around mid-morning. She could tell because his conversation with the work got quieter. Not in an obvious way, but in the way of someone who has been observed and has adjusted their radius accordingly. He didn't stop working. He didn't look at her directly. He just became more contained, the way a room feels different when someone in it knows they're being watched. The space between them had changed texture, and he knew it. Hank Briley came by at noon to check on the week's schedule and mentioned, in the way of someone reporting a mild weather event, that Garrett Odom had been asking around about the property. Vivian said she didn't know the name. Hank said Garrett sat on the Harlow Select Board, had been on it for 11 years, and had a real estate investment group that had looked at the Whitmore property 2 years before the county listed it and hadn't moved fast enough. He said it with the careful neutrality of a man who was telling her something without technically saying it. Vivian thanked him and let it sit. She'd built Vantage Biosciences from a 2-person licensing operation to a company with 4 facilities and a partnership with the Grayson Research Institute by understanding, early, that information had mass. It changed the weight of a room. You learned to feel when someone was introducing it deliberately. That evening, standing near the window in the long light, she heard herself ask Declan something she hadn't planned to ask. She said, "The northeast room. Who told you what it needed?" He was putting tools away. He didn't stop. He said, "The room told me. You just have to listen to what a space is trying to correct for." He picked up the canvas bag. He looked at her for a moment, level and unrevealing. "Rooms remember what they were used for," he said, "even when people don't." He left. Vivian stood in the room after he'd gone and looked at the curved panels fitted between the structural framing and thought about what it meant that a man who had designed 11 pediatric therapeutic spaces across 3 states was doing finish carpentry in a town of 1,000 people in northern Maine and hadn't mentioned it. The next 3 days moved in the specific rhythm that forms between people working in the same space without explicitly agreeing to. Declan arrived before 7. Sarah would appear at the edge of whatever room he was in each morning, never suddenly, never close, always by the same incremental progress, like the tide moving somewhere you weren't looking directly. No one marked it, no one made it a data point. He talked to her when he worked. Not at her, at the work in the way of someone thinking out loud, and Sarah happened to be in the room while he was doing it. He said that pine and maple handled sound differently. Pine absorbed. Maple reflected. He tapped a panel in 2 places and held it toward her so she could hear the variation. He said every material had a different way of catching light and a different way of letting sound pass through it, and that a room was just a collection of decisions about what to keep and what to let go. Sarah took out a small notepad she kept in her jacket pocket. She wrote something, considered it, then held it up. He read it. He said, "Yes, the curve changes the path. Sound doesn't like to go straight if you give it another option." He showed her, holding a finished panel so she could tap it in 3 places and hear the 3 different responses. She did. A small vertical line appeared between her eyebrows. She tapped the middle section again. She wrote something else, held it up. He read it and nodded once. "Exactly right," he said, and went back to work. Vivian was at the desk in the side office. She had found the conference archive for the 2018 symposium and was reading backward from it, following citations. She found a project called the Meridian Children's Center in Boston's South End. A proposed pediatric therapeutic campus, 2019, private and philanthropic funding coalition. Vantage had submitted a preliminary expression of interest in the funding structure that year. Declined. Cohort complete. The lead designer's name in the archived proposal was Pruitt. She sat still for a moment. She set the laptop aside. Her phone rang. Dr. Okafor from Sarah's treatment team in Portland. Vivian picked up. He said the things he always said. Therapeutic progress required structured exposure with trained facilitation, incidental contact with unfamiliar adults in uncontrolled environments. Regardless of apparent positive response, introduced variables that could destabilize established progress baselines. She should limit Sarah's time in the work environment and return to the scheduled program when they were back in Portland. He was not wrong. He was among the best in the state, and he cared about Sarah with more than professional obligation. His framework was sound. Vivian looked out the office window. Sarah was standing 4 feet from Declan. She had the notepad in one hand. She was pointing at something in the wood grain with the other. He looked where she pointed. He said something. She tilted her head and looked again. Vivian said yes, she understood, and thanked him, and ended the call, and didn't move from the window for another minute. The notice from the Harlow Select Board arrived by email late Thursday afternoon, copied simultaneously to Vivian's project manager and her legal counsel. The subject cited a procedural review of permits for construction activities in properties within the Harlow Historic District overlay. The technical objections were written in the specific language of challenges, designed to be difficult to refute without being precise enough to be easily wrong. She read it twice. She didn't need the sender's name. She forwarded it to General Counsel in Portland and spent 2 hours on calls. Her attorneys were measured. They said what attorneys say when they want you to feel managed, that these types of challenges were common, rarely decisive, response timeline was workable. She said she understood. She ended the call feeling none of what their tone had been designed to produce. Garrett Odom, she had learned by then, had sent a separate inquiry through a different channel. He'd contacted Hank Briley again, this time asking specifically about the carpenter, where he'd come from, how long he'd been in Harlow, whether Hank knew anything about his background. Hank, who was not a man built for concealment, had mentioned that Declan had shown up about 3 years back with a kid and not much else, and that he was the finest hand at reading a building Hank had encountered in 4 decades of construction. Vivian understood what Odom was looking for without knowing exactly what he'd find. She had a specific idea of what he might find if he looked carefully. She thought about telling Declan. She thought about why she kept choosing not to. He came in at 9 that evening, after Vivian had been at her desk for 3 hours alone, reading through old project files and not entirely reading them. He was carrying a folder. He set it on the table and stepped back. She opened it. The technical documentation for the challenge had been completely rewritten. Every item the Select Board's notice had cited had been addressed with precise citations to applicable Maine statutes and current building code provisions. The language had the specific structure of someone who understood not just construction, but regulatory architecture, where frameworks were vulnerable to challenge, and what kind of documentation made a challenge collapse before it required litigation. A Finnish carpenter, however exceptional, does not produce this. She looked at the folder. She looked at him. "I don't want to see this stopped," he said. He left. Vivian sat in the room for a long time after. The old building adjusted around her in the way buildings do at night. Small sounds, the structure settling into the cold, everything accommodating itself to what was. She thought about what he'd said and the precise distance between that sentence and everything it contained and didn't contain. Was he protecting the project? Or something he'd seen growing inside it, incrementally 3 feet closer each morning? She went to the library the following day. The Harlow Public Library had been run by a woman named June Alcott for 19 years. You could tell by the way she inhabited the building, not as an employee and not quite as an owner, more like someone who had organized her life around a place until the place had learned to organize itself around her in return. She was 63, with reading glasses she rarely used for reading, and a manner that suggested she found most situations more interesting than alarming. Vivian came for the town's historical property records, which existed on paper in the archive room, because Harlow had never funded a digitization project. June found them without complaint and showed her to a table in the back. They talked while Vivian worked. June asked how the renovation was proceeding. Vivian said well. June said that Declan Pruitt was a careful choice for that building, that she couldn't think of anyone who'd bring more attention to what it actually needed. Vivian said the work had been exceptional. June said, "It always has been, even before." Then she stopped. Vivian looked up. June had the expression of someone who has said slightly more than they meant to and is now deciding how to account for it. She took a breath. She set her glasses on the table. She said she'd known who Declan was before he came to Harlow. She'd read about the Pruitt plus Hale work when he showed up 3 years ago and hadn't said anything about it. She understood it was a choice he was making, to be here as who he was here, not who he'd been elsewhere. She'd respected it. Vivian said nothing. She waited. June said his wife's name was Laura. She was a pianist. She was killed by a driver running a red light in Boston's Back Bay on a February morning in 2021. It was 11 days before the Meridian Children's Center was scheduled to open. The room was quiet. The Meridian Center, June said, was the culmination of everything. 12 years of building spaces specifically for children who communicated outside of language. Non-verbal children. Children with complex trauma. Children who needed what he knew how to build. And he couldn't walk through the doors. After Laura died, he couldn't go back to that version of himself. The project opened without him. He gave the completion credit to his junior partner, dissolved the firm, packed what he and his daughter could carry, and drove north until the town felt like somewhere a person could be quieter than they had been. He'd bought the old Pruitt family land outside Harlow. He stayed. June said, "He's not hiding, he just couldn't go forward as who he was. He could only go forward as someone smaller. And he's been deciding, I think, for a while, whether smaller was going to be permanent." The archive room held the silence for a moment. Vivian said, "Garrett Odom came to you." June said he'd been by the previous week. He'd asked what she knew about Declan. She'd told him she knew he was a conscientious contractor and a good father. She did not say anything about being worried, but Vivian could see that she was. On the walk back, she came around the bend near the feed store and found Declan 20 feet ahead on the sidewalk. His daughter Wren was coming through the gate of the school lot, backpack riding low, already talking before she'd fully cleared the fence. Something about a science project and a teacher who'd explained plate tectonics wrong. Her hands moving with the specific energy of a child who has been saving up sentences all day for the right audience. Declan crouched to her level, unhurried. He listened with the full of his attention, not waiting for her to finish, not parsing it for the part that required a response, just actually listening. Vivian stopped walking. What she felt standing there had no clean name. It wasn't pity. It wasn't tenderness, exactly. It was closer to what happens when you've been reading something in the wrong light for a long time. And then you shift, and the words become what they actually say, and you realize you should have understood earlier, except that you couldn't have. Because the angle wasn't available to you yet. She stood there until they turned and walked the other direction. Then she walked back to the building alone. He finished the northeast room on a Wednesday morning. The work order had covered the main hall, the 2 west offices, and the utility access on the north end. The northeast room, the one with the unusual insulation, the one the building remembered differently, had not been on the order. But when Vivian arrived at 7:15, the smell of sawdust and something clean and light led her to the doorway. The walls were paneled in pale maple. The curved diffusion panels had been fitted between the structural elements in a pattern that marred the argument. Move the eye, with demanding it. The ceiling was lower than the rest of the building by 6 inches, which should have felt like confinement, and instead felt like being held. A single window, narrow, set high on the south wall, let light in at an angle that moved slowly across the floor as the morning progressed. In the corner, not centered, not prominent, simply present, a small chair, child-sized, with a cushion in a gray so pale it was almost not a color. Declan found her in the doorway. He didn't explain anything. He said, "Wren's already inside if you want to find them." She did. Wren was in the center of the room, turning slowly with her arms out, looking at the ceiling. She was telling Sarah something in the low, steady cadence of a child, reporting something genuinely interesting to someone she'd decided was worth telling. Vivian couldn't hear the words from the hall, only the cadence, and Sarah was standing with her face tilted up, listening. When Wren finished, Sarah took one step toward the chair. She stopped. She looked at it for a moment with the focused assessment of someone deciding whether a thing is safe to want. Declan walked out through the front of the building onto the porch. He didn't look at Sarah. He didn't issue permission. He simply removed himself from the equation, quietly and without ceremony, the way a person does when they understand that their presence is the last variable. Sarah stood in the room for a long moment. Then she walked to the chair and sat down. The room did what he had built it to do. The sound from outside, whined through the maples along the fence line, a car passing on the gravel road, a voice somewhere distant, came through the narrow window transformed. The panels caught it and arranged it into something the body could receive without bracing against. Not silence, not noise, something in between that didn't ask anything of you. Sarah looked up at the ceiling. Her hands, which she usually kept close to her sides, opened slightly in her lap. Then she opened her mouth. The sound was almost nothing. A small, careful push of air that shaped itself toward something and then dissolved before it fully arrived. Not a word, not language, but sound, the first sound Vivian's daughter had produced in front of anyone other than family in 2 years. And it lasted 4 seconds. And it was the most significant thing Vivian had witnessed since the morning she'd stood in a hospital corridor and been told her husband wasn't going to wake up. Wren went completely still. She didn't move towards Sarah. She didn't react in any of the ways a child typically reacts to something startling. She looked at her with the careful regard of someone who has decided this moment belongs to the other person and not to them. And she nodded once, slow and serious. Vivian was at the doorway. She did not know when she had moved there. She watched her daughter sit in the small maple-paneled room that a man had built without being asked, without being commissioned, without any expectation of credit, and she felt her knees go uncertain, and she put one hand against the doorframe and leaned her weight into the wall. The sound Vivian made was very small. She would not have said she made any sound at all. But Declan, on the porch, heard it. He came to the corridor. He looked through the doorway at Sarah in the chair, at Wren standing nearby, at Vivian with her shoulder against the wall and her hand over her mouth. He understood immediately. He stayed where he was. When Vivian came out 5 minutes later, she stood beside him on the porch, and neither of them said anything for a long time. The road was quiet, just the maples along the fence conducting their annual argument with the wind about whether it was time to let go. "You knew," she said finally. Past tense, not a question. He said, "I hoped." The words settled in the space between them and stayed there. The letter arrived on a Friday by process server. Garrett Odom's attorneys had identified a compliance issue. Declan's architectural license was registered in Massachusetts. Maine required independent reciprocal registration for professional practice in the state. The letter alleged unlicensed professional activity, demanded immediate suspension of all construction-related work, pending investigation by the Maine Office of Professional Regulation, and had been copied to the Select Board, the Property Manager, and the Harlow Register. It was competently written. It had cost Odom something, and he'd produced it anyway, which told Vivian he'd stopped gathering information and started applying pressure. Declan read the letter at the workbench. He folded it and put it in his jacket pocket and continued working for 35 minutes before he sat down. Vivian found out the same way Harlow found out. Odom had sent a copy of the complaint letter to the register with a public statement about the importance of professional licensing standards for projects in the historic overlay district. The paper posted it that afternoon. The headline was careful and pointed in the way that small-town journalism occasionally manages to be both at once. She called Declan. He didn't answer. She drove to his house. It was a Cape-style house on a dirt road outside town. the kind that had been added to over decades, without anyone worrying about the additions matching. Small and orderly. Firewood stacked against the south wall. A child's winter boots on the step. Wren's bike leaning against the fence post at the angle of someone who'd left it in a hurry and not come back for it. Yet. Declan opened the door. She was inside for less than a minute before she saw the drawings. They covered the wall of the room that served as both office and dining room. Blueprints, pencil elevations, technical sections pinned at angles that suggested someone who had been in ongoing conversation with them and never quite put them away. She recognized the Meridian floor plan from the portfolio she'd read. She recognized the notations in the margins, his handwriting, precise and technical, but also the handwriting of a person who hadn't stopped thinking about something even after they'd walked away from it. He had never taken them down. He explained the legal situation with the flatness of someone working through a mechanical problem. Maine's reciprocal licensure process, timeline for application, the nature of the work performed, which fell within renovation supervision rather than original licensed design, which created a meaningful distinction in how the complaint would be evaluated. He said Odom wasn't going to win this, and he knew it. He said he just hadn't anticipated the public dimension. Vivian said, "Why didn't you tell me about the license situation when we started?" He said, "Because it was my problem." She said, "You were working on my building." The silence that followed had weight. He sat with it. She sat with it. Who was going to stop Odom? And what it would cost Declan to have his name become public property here, in the town where he'd built a quiet life precisely because nobody had needed to look at him. Her legal team was thorough, and they were fast. She gave them one instruction. Go back 10 years and find the structure. They found it in 7 hours. Consulting fees paid to a real estate advisory LLC, registered in Delaware. Odom's brother-in-law was a registered agent. The pattern connected to 6 different developers who had received favorable zoning variance approvals from the Harlow Select Board over 9 years. The individual amounts were modest. The aggregate was not. The pattern was clear enough that her general counsel said he would be surprised if the complaint letter survived the week. He was right. By Monday morning, the letter had been withdrawn, with language about ongoing procedural review and an abundance of caution. Garrett Odom's office issued a brief statement about family circumstances requiring his attention. The Select Board issued a brief statement about the conclusion of its permit review. The construction permit was reinstated, but the Register had already run the story. Not Odom's version, a follow-up piece by the paper's one full-time journalist, who had found the professional history behind the dispute more interesting than the dispute itself and had investigated accordingly. The piece was respectful. The details were accurate. By Wednesday morning, Harlow knew that its most reserved, Finnish carpenter had spent 12 years designing therapeutic spaces for children who couldn't speak, had built some of the most significant pediatric environments in New England, and had been living in their town for 3 years without mentioning it. Declan walked through the hardware store that morning and felt this change. People looked at him and then away, or looked at him and said something. It didn't matter which. Both were the same kind of attention, and he had spent 3 years living without it deliberately. He came home and stood in the kitchen for a long time. Ran came home from school that afternoon quieter than usual. She did her homework at the table. She ate dinner. She helped clear the dishes. Then she came and sat on the couch next to her father and was quiet for a moment in the particular way of a child who has been thinking about something all day and has decided to say it. She said, "People were talking about you at school." He said, "I know." She said, "I knew you weren't just a carpenter. I figured you'd tell me when you were ready." Declan looked at his daughter. He tried to find words for what that sentence cost him to hear, and didn't have them yet. He put his hand briefly on the back of her head. "The way you do, when language isn't available," and she leaned into it for a moment before sitting back up. The following morning, Declan found a folded piece of paper on the workbench when he arrived. He didn't know when it had been left there, or how Sarah had gotten in before anyone else. He opened it. Inside was a pencil drawing. Careful, deliberate lines. A child who looked at things closely before committing them to paper. The northeast room, the chair in the corner, the narrow window with its diagonal bar of light crossing the floor, and in the doorway, 2 figures. One taller, one not, neither one labeled. He stood at the workbench for a long time holding the paper. Outside the window, the maples along the fence were doing what Maine maples do in October's final week, giving up the last of the color in long, slow increments, going from fire to rust to something quieter and just as honest. He folded the drawing carefully and put it in his chest pocket. The renovation finished in the last days of October. Harlow returned to its routines. The select board returned to its routines without Odom, who had tendered his resignation citing personal reasons. Hank Briley told two people at the diner that it was the cleanest piece of general contracting he'd been part of in 30 years, which in Harlow meant it would be common knowledge by Friday. Declan did not return to the version of himself from 4 weeks prior. Something in the quality of his quietness had changed. It was no longer the silence of a man who had decided not to expect anything. It was the silence of a man who was deciding something new and hadn't said what yet. Vivian found him in the northeast room on the last afternoon, checking the panel seams. She stood in the doorway. She said, "I want to make you a formal offer." She said it the way she said things she had prepared and had decided would not be softened by the preparation. Not finish work. Design lead for the Therapeutic Spaces program Vantage is building. Harlow and 3 properties in pre-acquisition. Full design authority. He was quiet long enough that she thought he was going to say no. He said, "The last time I built a room for a child who couldn't speak, I wasn't there when the door opened." She waited. He said, "If I do this again, I need to know I'll be there." She understood he was not talking about buildings. She said, "Yes, the last morning arrived the way last mornings do, with a logic that had been moving toward it all along, quietly and without announcement." Sarah came before anyone else. She walked through the unlocked front door and went directly to the northeast room, where Declan was doing a final check on the window trim. She stood in front of him. He turned and looked at her. She looked back directly, with the focused deliberateness of someone who has been preparing something privately and is now ready to deliver it. Then she said 2 syllables. Clear, separated, placed with precision. "Thank you." Declan did not speak. He lowered himself to one knee, unhurried, and looked at her and nodded once. The slow nod of a person confirming something that matters and can't be returned in kind. She held his eyes for a moment. Then she turned and walked out. When Vivian arrived an hour later, she could tell from the way Sarah moved. Lighter, different. Not triumphant but released. The way a thing feels, after it's been carried a long time and then set down in the right place, that something had already happened. She didn't ask. She let it belong to Sarah. The car came at 11. Sarah stood on the gravel drive with her jacket buttoned and the notepad in her pocket and her eyes on the fence line where the last of the maple leaves were still making up their minds. Declan came out to the porch steps, 20 feet of gravel road between them, enough distance that neither of them had to manage anything. Vivian took a card from her coat pocket. Cream, small, her name and a number and the address in Portland. She held it out. He came down and took it. She didn't say anything. He turned it over in his hand. He looked at it the way a person looks at something they've decided not to put away. The car pulled out. He stood on the road and watched it reach the bend and disappear around the trees. Wren came and stood beside him, close, the way she stood when she wanted to be present without making a claim on it. She said, "Are you going to call?" He looked at the card. He looked at the empty road where the car had been. He looked at his daughter beside him, who already knew the answer and was asking anyway, the way people do when they want to hear you say a true thing out loud. And for the first time in 3 years, he smiled. Not the version he kept available for public occasions. The real one, arriving without being summoned, taking him slightly off guard. It felt like the first morning of something he didn't have a name for yet, but intended, this time, to stay long enough to find out.